Hey everybody, this is John with another installment of Think Culture, and today we're going to be talking about a very controversial topic, which is the pornification of American, or let's just say modern Western culture. Everything has been pornified. Porn is omnipresent. Everyone's watching porn. Everyone's what are they called? A geeker or something like that. Um, uh, and it's our culture revolves around it. It's a dominant sort of phenomenon. Sexuality is pervasive everywhere. You can't even watch the Olympics without sexual imagery and things like that going on. So we're going to look at how we got to this point. What's the intellectual history? What is the trajectory that leads us to a situation where this sort of thing could be, pervasive in our culture? I initially was going to switch porn to corn or something like that to try to avoid censorship, but it became very cumbersome, so I didn't do that. I also recorded this video once before, and it was like 42 minutes, and then I realized afterward that I forgot to go to split screen, and I wanted to show you guys some stuff and had talked about it, so I'm having to redo it, which is painful. It's very painful. But I do think that it's an important and interesting topic. I think it's important that people understand this intellectual trajectory in general, but also, this is a specific issue that a lot of people are interested in today. And I was encouraged to make this video, or I decided to make this video based on an interaction that I had with Nick Fuentes on Twitter, where Nick Fuentes was talking to Darren Beatty and they were talking about this topic. And Nick Fuentes was basically suggesting the Jews were responsible. I like Nick. I think that he's interesting. He's funny. He's smart. Every time I've seen him, I've liked him. But he does seem to have this kind of fascination with a particular group of people, with this particular group. And he was saying that he thought that they were responsible. And so Darren Beatty was like having an argument with him about this. And one of the things that he referred to is that he thought he was like everyone in charge of all these porn companies and stuff is Jewish. And I thought to myself, like, it doesn't matter at all. The question would be, how did we become the kind of culture that would allow this to be mainstreamed, that would have so divested the body and sexuality of any kind of mystique, of any kind of sacredness or whatever, that we would think it's okay, that we would accept it, that we would allow the mass distribution of it and the consumption of it. That would be the question to me, which it has nothing to do with who's in charge of what company at this particular moment. So I'm not, I don't find that to be a definitive sort of thing. However, I did look it up. I spent about 2 minutes, which is an enormous amount of research. I'm good. Uh, I did spend about 2 minutes, which is pretty good. And it doesn't seem like there's an overwhelming Jewish control of porn. Chatterbait is. I tried to look at the biggest like video companies and the biggest sort of chat video companies, and like Chatterbait seems to be associated with Shirley Lara, who is not Jewish. Bang Bros seems to be associated with some like Latino brothers who are not Jewish. OnlyFans does seem to be associated with someone who's Jewish, so there is a point for Nick. We can put that one on the board. X videos does not seem to be associated with anyone Jewish. ILO, which apparently is like a giant media conglomerate that owns a bunch of different porn distribution websites, like RedTube, YouPorn, Pornhub, PornTube, stuff like that. That was founded by someone who wasn't Jewish and then sold to two people, one of whom was Jewish. So that's a third of a point for Nick. So if we check the scoreboard, so it doesn't seem to be that they don't seem to be that omnipresent in terms of the control and distribution of porn in contemporary America. But whatever. They're probably overrepresented, but that's just the way that it is in general. Anything uh, lucrative or requiring a lot of education or something like that, just how it's going to be. Um, but not the main topic of our video. What we're going to be talking about is the intellectual history, right? We're going to be talking about how did we get here? What is the trajectory in terms of the evolution of the consciousness of Western peoples that has led us to this point, right? For that purpose, I'm going to split screen this time and we'll start talking about it, okay? So, before our current situation, I'm going to go sort of reverse chronologically. So, we can talk about Hugh Hefner, who, of course, is not Jewish. And he's, I think, the main person that people would associate with porn becoming mainstream in America. He's the founder of Playboy magazine, obviously. Everyone knows him for like the Playboy bunnies, Playboy mansions. He's huge in this field, obviously. And uh, he's an interesting guy. I watched an interview with him a long time ago on Firing Line with Buckley, and in that interview, he does try to provide some intellectual justification for what he's doing, and he couches it in terms of things like freedom of speech, freedom of expression, individual liberty, things like that. And that's going to be a theme throughout our trajectory here. You're going to find. Um, he specifically mentions Alfred Kinsey, and we're going to get into Alfred Kinsey in a little bit. But yeah, we have Hugh Hefner here. He's important in this process, obviously. Then we have Larry Flint, who again is not Jewish. And these are sort of the two main guys that I was going to do, and I was going to talk about in terms of like this is America getting to a point of mainstream distribution and acceptance of pornography. Basically, I see it as this guy's Playboy and Hustler. And again, he talks about this in terms of freedom of speech and things like that. He's not Jewish. I don't know if I said that before. But it's a little more hardcore than Playboy. Playboy is supposed to be sort of intellectually substantive to some degree too. It has essays and things like that. Hustler is just like spread them wide and take a shot or whatever. It's much more hardcore, um, and unabashed. Wow. Oh, as number one on the 50 most powerful people in porn. Okay, so see, he deserves to be on this list. Actually, I was gonna do these two though, and then I thought I don't want to give the impression that I'm just like avoiding Jews in terms of my genealogy here, in terms of my intellectual history. And so I was like, you know what? I'll throw in Goldstein. I don't know why this is highlighted. I did not highlight that. Um, that's interesting. I don't know why that's the case. Oh wow. Back. Okay. But yeah, I don't know why this is highlighted. Goldstein is Jewish, so I was trying to throw a bone here. I'm like, okay, well, I'll throw a Jew in. And he is influential. He's friends with Larry Flint and stuff like that. He founded a magazine. What was it called? Screw magazine, and it's pretty hardcore. I think it's even more hardcore than Hustler. And he's associated with other stuff too, though. Like I think like magazines where like people are dying and stuff like that. And he's really an extremist politically. He associates what he's doing much more with politics. The other two guys, they make the case that it's a kind of libertarian freedom. You should be in control of your body. You should have the right to watch or say or do whatever you want, insofar as it doesn't harm other people. Blah blah blah. Goldstein, he's a little bit more extreme with that. He's a little bit more explicit, although I think you'll find it in these guys too. But he's a little bit more explicit about like we're fighting against, the taboos, the stigmas. The society has repressed our sexuality, and we need to, de-repress it. We want to be free, and fight against authoritarian control over our bodies and our sexual desires and things like that. Um, and he says stuff like he's a free speech extremist and free speech is his religion. Um, what did I say? And it's, to be clear, he's Jewish, but he's an atheist, right? What does it mean to be a Jew? To which he responded, "It doesn't mean anything. It means I'm called a kike." Do you believe in God? Goldstein said, "I believe in me. I'm God." Right. And again, this is every Jew that I put in my little intellectual history here. This is going to be true for, basically, that he um yeah, that he, what was I gonna say? Going to be true for all of them, right? They hate sort of religion. They're atheists, whatever. They're fighting against religion, and they worship the self, right? And so these guys basically grow out of the sexual revolution. This is, a period in the 60s and 70s in the West in which you get the normalization of contraception, public nudity, pornography, premarital sex, homosexuality, masturbation, all this kind of stuff, right? It's all part and parcel with the sexual revolution, which we're all sort of familiar with. This is part of the like mainstream conversation that we have in the United States about the origins of our culture and stuff like that. But it was huge, right? This is I don't know if you'd get these guys like without the sexual revolution. This is when everything sort of breaks down and we're like, okay, like depathologize the body, destigmatize it, destigmatize sexuality and other forms of sexuality and all this kind of stuff. So where do we get the sexual revolution? Well, Hugh Hefner in his interview with Buckley says that he's heavily influenced by Alfred Kinsey, or he might not say I'm heavily influenced by, but in his justification for what he's doing, he references Alfred Kinsey, and he says something like, "Have you seen the Kinsey reports? These like all these deviant sexual behaviors are very normal. This is normal human life and normal human experiences, and we should just embrace them. If they're normal and natural, then they're okay." Buckley, of course, points out that that's the naturalistic fallacy, but he's referring to Kinsey. Like he obviously understands and justifies what he's doing within the context of Alfred Kinsey, who's an American sexologist. And yeah, he's treating sex and sexuality as a scientific object. We're trying to understand human sexual behavior, detached from any kind of conception about traditional morality, detached from any conception of what, a teleological conception of sexuality as for reproduction or something like that, detached from any kind of religious understanding, just purely as a scientific object, right? As a natural phenomenon to be studied through with the tools of empirical science. And so he determines like everybody's a homo. No, he's like homosexual behavior is much more common. Masturbation is much more common. All of this kind of stuff. And he was this shocked people, right? And it was apparently a huge influence on American culture and sort of public discourse in America. And I think leads into the sexual revolution and clearly is an influence on these guys, right? Explicitly cited here by Hugh Hefner. So this is Kinsey's big. So where does Kinsey come from, right? Well, we do have a pair of Jews that I put in my list here. uh, Basically, everyone associated with the Frankfurt School is Jewish, and that's basically what we're talking about here. Marcuse is an interesting figure. He writes Eros and Civilization, and this is a big influence on people during the sexual revolution. And in it, he makes the argument that the repression of sexual desires produces it produces like individual psychopathology, but it also produces social and political pathologies. That this this oppression and repression of the sexual instincts is bad, and we need to get rid of it. We need to sort of to be free, right? And that everything bad about contemporary Western culture or whatever can be sort of linked to the repression of the sexual instincts. And that we need to get rid of them, right? So this is a big influence on people, and he's you could call him like it doesn't say it here, I guess, but you could call him something like a Freudo-Marxist, which is the case for quite a few people associated with the Frankfurt School. Um, yeah, but the question becomes, where are these guys coming from? And I don't think that they're an enormous direct influence on somebody like Kinsey, but they are an influence for sure in the sexual revolution, and so is somebody like Kinsey. Wilhelm Reich I put on here too. He's sort of, I think sometimes he's called called like a associate of the Frankfurt School, but not exactly a member or whatever. He's much more radical. Uh, than they are in terms of his emphasis on sexuality. Yeah, I guess he coined the phrase the sexual revolution. That would be interesting. Acted as its midwife. So he's important, right? And he founds like really strange, um, like clinical, like therapeutic techniques and stuff in relation to sexuality. He's one of these like weird, like sexual hippie cult type of guys. He thinks the orgasm is really important. He treats Freudian libido as basically talking about orgasmic energy, like orgone energy, and that managing our health and things like that requires that we manage our orgone energy. So like masturbation maybe is like a kind of therapeutic technique, things like that. But he's really obsessed with sexuality. And yeah, like both of these guys are influenced by Freud. Freud, despite what people say about him, he doesn't have the attitudes about sexuality and about repression that people sort of attribute to him. He is much less radical than these guys. Like these guys are like proponents of the sexual revolution for sure, and like sexual disinhibition. Sigmund Freud is not. He thinks that sexuality is very important, and it's important in the determination of what's going on with us psychologically, but that it's not something that just needs to be like totally disinhibited. In his book, Civilization and Its Discontents, for example, he argues that repression is good, basically. He argues that you can't have a civilization without repression, that in order to have civilization, you have to repress the erotic and aggressive instincts of people to some degree. By repressing those things, you cause a kind of incidence of psychopathology. But you couldn't just stop repressing them or you wouldn't have society anymore. There would just be total chaos and total breakdown, right? And so what you should do is try to sort of manage and take care of the incidence of psychopathology that's a natural effect of repression by helping them to sublimate in different ways and things like that. You take care of these neuroses sort of on an individual basis. Um, you don't just abolish all of society's stigmas and things like that. That's like the direction that these guys sort of go, but that's not the direction that Sigmund Freud goes. He is known, like, he's controversial in his time for the seduction theory. I don't know if it's talked about in here at all. Um, I don't see it here. But he was arguing at the time that hysteria was a product of the early sort of childhood, like early exposure to sexuality of young girls by family members and things like that. I think usually. I don't know what the status of that sort of theory is now, but it was very controversial at the time because he suggested that seduction was widespread, that this was a common sort of phenomenon because all these women were hysterical. I think people don't talk about hysteria anymore diagnostically, probably just because of wokeness. I think it's still the case that women are all hysterical. um, but I don't know about what I would say about the seduction theory. I'm not that hip to it. But anyway, yeah, he is significant. People are influenced by him, and he does have a kind of focus on sexuality and in a like scientific sort of way, right? He's interested in it as a kind of a scientific object, right? We should be thinking about sexuality, but he doesn't necessarily say things like we should we should be engaged in like public acts of homosexuality and like be talking about masturbating together and stuff like that. That's not Freud. He's pretty conservative in a lot of ways, actually. But he's heavily influenced by Havelock Ellis, right? So these guys are Jewish, right? Marcuse, Reich, and Freud. Havelock Ellis is not Jewish, and he's a precursor to all of this stuff, right? When you want to talk about like sexology, again, he's not Jewish. You really want to go back and talk about Havelock Ellis. And Sigmund Freud is influenced by Havelock Ellis. He has communications with him. They have a correspondence. Havelock Ellis publishes on things like about sexuality, and from the perspective of a physician and a scientist who's writing about those things. He does that before Freud, and Freud is influenced by it, right? He's influenced by this orientation to sexuality, that we can be scientific, we can be a medical expert thinking about sexuality and its effects in this kind of objective scientific way. And he's also associated with the progressive movement. If you recall, I have another video on eugenics in which I talk a lot about the progressive movement. Lo and behold, he's a eugenicist too. Eugenics, sexual revolution, progressive movement. Like I said, a lot of our cultural pathologies, they share a common sort of intellectual history. They share a genealogy. And so that's part of why I think a video like this is a good idea, because it introduces people to the sort of basic intellectual history of what I view as like all of our sort of modern pathologies. The progressive movement is definitely linked to them. And yeah, they're eugenicists, as you see in my other video. And he's part of this movement. He hangs out with a lot of these progressives, and he's an influence on them. We'll talk about that more in a second, what progressivism is. But he studied human sexuality. He did it as a scientist, as a medical expert, and he wrote a bunch on it. And he wrote about masturbation. He wrote about autoeroticism. He wrote about homosexuality. He wrote about transsexuality. And his perspective is always sort of like, we need to get away from Victorian sexual morality and embrace the reality that all of these sexual behaviors are natural. We need to think about them as natural phenomena. And with our progressive orientation, like scientifically, like rationally embrace sexuality as a normal thing and accept it into sort of normal mainstream sort of society. He thinks homosexuality shouldn't be prohibited, shouldn't be illegal. He thinks he's the first person, I think, to start talking about transgenderism as belonging to a different category than homosexuality. But he's important. If you want to understand this stuff, I would suggest you go back and you have a look at Havelock Ellis. He's an important guy, and he's not, I think, well enough remembered. Do I not have? Oh, to bring this over here. Okay, so then we can talk about the progressive era. Again, he's part of the progressive era, and this was an era like you can talk about progressivism as a movement sort of more broadly, or the progressive era specifically as a time in which the progressive movement is very popular in America. But basically, in the progressive movement, right, they're devoted to the scientific and rational optimization of our institutions, of our ways of life. They're dedicated to the idea that we should move away from traditional authority, we should move away from traditional morality, and we should treat things as scientific objects to be rationally managed so that we can figure out the most efficient, productive ways of doing everything. And we should be scientific about it. We shouldn't be nostalgic. We shouldn't be sentimental. We shouldn't be moralizing. So that's what they're doing. And progressivism, it sucks. They're responsible for a lot of stuff like women's suffrage. You can associate them with feminism in general. They're an influence on the sexual revolution for sure. They're associated with like Woodrow Wilson is a progressive in America. And again, like, I think, do I have a video on I might talk about him a little bit in my video on I forget what it's called, ESG. Because Woodrow Wilson is really responsible for the creation of the modern administrative state. So he's terrible too, and he's at the center of a different kind of history that then flows into this same intellectual trajectory, right? And it's all bad. You know, everything that comes out of this intellectual history are uh, poisoned fruits, right? Um, yeah, so that's progressivism. Then, so what are the influences on people like Havelock and on progressivism and things like that? Well, we can move back further and we talk about libertinism. And libertinism, I watched a movie when I was maybe in high school. I think it had like Johnny Depp in it. And I think it might have been like he was John Wilmot, second Earl of Rochester, in that movie. But he was somebody like that or whatever. But the idea is basically it followed around somebody who was a libertine in this period. And for this period, we're talking about like the 18th century mostly. In the 18th century, and again, this is an important century, right? This is the century of the French and American revolutions. Like, this is kind of key moment of transition here. And in this period, we see the emergence of a kind of a lived philosophy called libertinism. And they're hedonists who basically they spurn traditional authority, the church, right? They're anti-clerical. They spurn any kind of social restrictions, norms, taboos. They violate them all, and they say basically, no, I'm an individual. Individuals are free. We have rights, and we should be able to pursue our own interests and our own desires without being stopped by external authorities. External authority is illegitimate, and my desires are natural, right? My desire to have lots of weird sex parties and stuff like that is natural. These are natural desires, and I should be free to express them. I should be free to express myself. I should be free to write smut, because these guys are, writing. They're basically writing porn. They're writing, disgusting pornographic novels and things like that, and they're living it out, in their lives. They spurn accepted morals by larger society. They're described as an extreme form of hedonism. Their material, their thinking is also rooted in materialism. They think, we should understand that human beings are bodies, right? We should dispense with all of this naive metaphysical mumbo jumbo about souls and values and things like that. There's just bodies. Bodies interact. There's a network of causes and effects, and if it feels good, you should do it. You should pursue what feels good, right? Um, and so that's what these guys are doing. There's a bunch of them: John Wilmot, Marquis de Sade. Initially, I was going to talk about some other people: Diderot, Laclos. Yeah, I think I initially was going to include those guys. Théophile Duval. Um, but yeah, there's a bunch of these guys, and libertinism, right? It emerges, obviously, liberty, libertine, libertarian. It emerges out of the philosophy of liberalism, right? Liberalism as a political philosophy. And again, go back, right? What's Hugh Hefner talking about? Hugh Hefner, Larry Flint, Al Goldstein, they're talking about individual rights, the freedom of expression, the freedom of speech, the freedom of conscience. I'm an individual. I should, without external restraint, be able to pursue my own interests and desires, et cetera. So, that's this sort of through line here through everything, right? We have them already here. If these libertines, if you transported John Wilmot into 1970, he'd probably be worse than any of these three guys. you know, we already have them here. And again, like let's talk about Marquis de Sade. And yeah, just to be clear, Havelock Ellis is not Jewish. None of these libertines are Jewish. Marquis de Sade is not Jewish. um, and Marquis de Sade again, like he's like the worst kind of degenerate. He's as bad as it gets, right? He's eventually imprisoned for sex crimes, blasphemy, pornography. He's disgusting. And again, like people are talking about his stuff hundreds of years later. You get like 120 Days of Sodom, right, as a film that's made in the 20th century, and spoken about in hushed tones, and references to Marquis de Sade are made in like all these elites. You know, we still have, like, Desaadianism, you could say, I think is still this is P Diddy. You know, we see this stuff still today. Like P Diddy is probably has a book by Marquis de Sade on his bedside. Marquis de Sade is very influential, even though, you know, he's not talked about publicly in, you know, polite society for a long time. Now he's almost banal, you know, to talk about Marquis de Sade. It's almost like you're boring, like you're trying to be offensive and scandalous or whatever. But he was scandalous, but influential in terms of his scandalousness. And he was disgusting, you know. And he's, again, like, he explicitly makes philosophical arguments like we should be totally free, totally unimpeded by society. We need absolutely to get away from religion and tradition and authority, and every individual should be free in and amongst in himself to pursue his own interests and desires. You know, the point of life is just to have sex, right? To have pleasure. We should all just be pursuing pleasure, and I should be able to do whatever I want. Like, why should you be able to tell me what to do? You don't know what's good. I don't know what's good. You know, it's all a guessing game or something. So who are the influences on Marquis de Sade? Uh, these three guys I talked about quite a bit in my video on Crisis of the European Mind. This is these are the guys who are sort of the main culprits in the book Crisis of the European Mind, which is an intellectual history written by Paul Hazard about 1780 to or 1680 to 1715. So yeah, it's like we're leading right into 18th century libertinism with these guys, and they're so Pierre Bayle and Jean Toland, they're bad guys in that book. No, they're so at that time in Europe, you have a lot of people fleeing as he does as a Huguenot to the Dutch Republic. It becomes a kind of locus of opposition to tradition, traditional authority, traditional morality, the church, monarchy, right? So it's where all these radical, quote unquote, free thinkers go to live. And Pierre Bayle is one of the foremost of these quote unquote free thinkers. And he's a major argument for religious toleration, for skeptical philosophy. He is engaged in a lot of arguments with the church, like with specific members of the church and things like that, and arguing for freedom of conscience. You know, the government and the church should not be able to tell me what to believe. I'm an individual. I have to come to knowledge on my own. I have rights. You know, we should be free to think and do as we want, insofar as it doesn't influence other people. Blah blah blah. Um, and he's pretty extreme, right? Let's see what it says here about his skepticism. Pierre Bayle was a skeptic who used his historical and critical dictionary, that's the one he wrote, to criticize all prior known theories and philosophies, right? Everything should be put under the knife of skeptical, secular rationality, right? In Bayle's view, humans were inherently incapable of achieving true knowledge because of the limitations of human reason. Men should adhere instead to their own conscience. Bayle was critical of many influential rationalists as well as empiricists. Reason, is a guide that leads one astray, and philosophy can be compared to some powders that are so corrosive that after they have eaten away the infected flesh of a wound, they then devour the living flesh, rot the bones, and penetrate to the very marrow. Philosophy at first refutes errors. Yeah. But if it is not stopped at this point, it goes on to attack truths. And when it is left on its own, it goes so far that it no longer knows where it is and can find no stopping place. This is basically the trajectory we get um, with the emphasis on rationality, individualism, freedom of conscience, free thought, or whatever that occurs at this time, right? John Toland, he's an even more extreme, and again, you know, Pierre Bayle is not Jewish. um, when we talk about like Marquis de Sade, you know, we could talk about other people too. Like Rabelais is pretty important, influential, not Jewish. John Toland, not Jewish. He's a Irish rationalist, philosopher, and freethinker, occasional satirist. You can think about Voltaire here too. Voltaire's he doesn't really come up with his own original ideas. I don't consider Voltaire really to be a philosopher, even although in philosophy people will talk about Candide and stuff. But he is super influential in terms of popularizing sort of Lockean ideas of individualism, and this like radical skepticism and antipathy toward the church, traditional authority, and the state. Right at this time, Protestantism and free thinkers, Protestantism and free thinkers, and people who oppose like anti-monarchists, all of that stuff goes together, right? It's like a generalized attack on tradition, authority, hierarchy, like all of that emerges out of these people, and it emerges from this kind of basic philosophy that Locke articulates. But yeah, Toland is even more radical than Bale. He is like really opposed to Christianity. Let's see what if they give much of a no. uh, Seminal work in both free thought and Irish philosophy. That's great. That's a good description there. Somebody should get on. Somebody should get onto this Wikipedia page. But he's really critical. He writes about like how every miracle is basically a lie or whatever. Um, there's there's just human beings and rational reason, right? He argued that the divine revelation of the Bible contains no true mysteries. All the dogmas of faith can be understood from natural principles and reason. Right? So again, he has this insistence on rational secular reason as being our only way of understanding the truth about things. He was the first person called a free thinker. He went on to write over 100 books in various domains, but mostly dedicated to criticizing ecclesiastical institutions uh, in support of Whigs. So again, like Whig historiography is progressive history. Whigs are progressives. Many scholars know him for his role as either the biography or editor of English republicanism. Whatever. His views became more radical. His opposition to hierarchy in the church led to opposition to hierarchy in the state. Like I'm saying, the two things get connected. People opposing Catholicism wind up also attacking monarchies, and these monarchs are mostly Catholic, right? People attacking Catholic monarchies or whatever, they wind up attacking the church too. They wind up going together because it's just a general sort of antipathy. It's an antinomianism, right? It's like the world and all of its rules and traditions or whatever. This is all garbage. I should be free to do whatever I want, right? That's like this sort of adolescent attitude is at the base of this whole thing, really, of this whole trajectory. Um, Hierarchy to state, in other words, were as bad as each other, bishops and kings, right? And monarchy had no God given sanction as a form of government. Um, why people are prone to forms of false consciousness, right? This is a phrase that becomes popular later. Um, Liberty was the defining characteristic of what it means to be a human, right? So he thinks you have to be free. Freedom is the basic fact of human life, right? And again, you get from liberty, right? Libertarian, libertine, liberal, right? They all come from liberal political philosophy, which is this guy. He's the father of liberal political philosophy. For Toland, reason and tolerance were the twin pillars of the good society. Anyway, I don't know why I'm reading so much on his page, just because I just now realized that there's actually some content on it. Um, Perfect equality among freeborn citizens, whatever. Um, but yeah, he's pretty intense, dude. He was not beyond whipping up some of the baser anti-Catholic sentiments of his day in his attacks on the Jacobites. Anyway, so these guys are influenced by John Locke. John Locke is one of the most important philosophers in history. He's part of the movement of British empiricism, one of the most important philosophers of the Enlightenment, and the father of liberalism, right? He posits that the tabula rasa theory of mind, it doesn't say tabula rasa here for some reason, but the idea of the tabula rasa is blank slate. The mind is nothing, right? All knowledge has to come from experience. So when you're born, there's nothing written on the mind. It knows nothing, right? Which means, and is going to mean later for people like Marxists or whatever, the mind is a blank slate. You can write anything on it you want to. Everything that it thinks is arbitrary. It's capricious. It's a social construction. All of its institutions, its religions, etc. You could have written something else there. It could have different institutions, different norms, different morality, right? That's kind of one of the long-term implications of a theory of mind like that. But it's like a natural playing out of the ideas of British empiricism. How you get to that kind of position. Oh, it does say tabula rasa right there. Um, and as far as liberal political philosophy, right, he writes about the labor theory of value. I think he might be the person who first articulates the labor theory of value, but I'm not 100% sure. I think so. Um, and he thinks that that what's important to him is natural rights, the natural law, and the inborn natural human rights that we all have. We're all individuals, right? We are in charge of our own mind, right? Knowledge we derive at through experience, so it's up to us. It's our responsibility. We should have the right freedom of speech, freedom of expression, all this sort of stuff. He's the person that articulates that. The right of revolution. I don't remember what all I said about him earlier. I said something a little oh yeah, he also writes like the second treatise on government, for example, which is an influence in the Glorious Revolution. Like he's justifying William of Orange becoming the new Protestant monarch. They're deposing the Catholic one in a coup, replacing him with a Protestant one. That's, again, part of this process, right? All of these free thinkers, that's what's becoming prominent in Europe. There's this transformation in human consciousness in Europe going on at this time, a crisis of European reason, in which suddenly, like, I think the way that he puts it, Hazard puts it in that book, is like, in the space of like 30 years or whatever, people go from thinking like it's crazy to criticize the stuff the church says, monarchies make sense, etc., to all of a sudden they're like, no, we're all individuals with rights. We should be free to do and think and say as we want as long as it doesn't harm other people, blah, 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 blah. The church is wrong. They shouldn't be able to tell me what to do, etc. Right? All this sort of transformation. And yeah, so he writes that, and he writes the letter on tolerance, which comes to posit tolerance as a Christian virtue, which doesn't really make sense. Like traditionally, you would have like Christian charity, right? So if somebody believes a heresy, something that's going to get them damned, you're not nice for like accepting that and letting them continue to believe that. That's mean. You're looking at them, you're not trying to prevent them from being damned to hell for eternity. That's cruelty. So actually, the Christian thing to do would be to change their mind. Even force them to change their mind or whatever. But he comes to argue that tolerance is a Christian virtue. And again, the reason that they support stuff like that, like freedom of conscience, tolerance, freedom of choice, freedom of speech, is precisely because there are these antinomian radicals fighting against the Catholic Church and Catholic monarchies. So they're like, no, don't, everyone has a right to think whatever they want to think. you know, I'm not actually like a heretic that should be punished by the state or something like that, or by the church. I'm just exercising my rights. Everyone has rights. You don't have the right to do that. They have a self-interest kind of investment in these ideas. Um, but yeah, we could go all the way back here and say like John Locke. We don't need to stop here either. But this is a moment of radical transformation, and he's a big part of it. All three of these guys are part of this sort of early transformation, right? And we're looking at the product historically of this crisis of European reason. If you don't have John Locke, John Toland, Pierre Bayle, you never get Hugh Hefner, right? It's this movement away from the church, away from traditional morality, this coming to view traditional authority, traditional morality as an imposition, as something oppressive, that the individual with his inalienable rights should struggle against, right? It's that attitude, these emerging attitudes, that produce this trajectory, right? Um, you don't, like Hugh Hefner and Larry Fink and Al Goldstein, right? They're writing from out of this period of the sexual revolution. Sexual revolution, in terms of the way that sex is viewed culturally, this is a transformation in the way we think about it. That's a direct sort of consequence of Kinsey and the Frankfurt School guys and people like that, right? The body is being destigmatized, demystified, depathologized, and it's a playing out of this, like rational secular reason, empirical science. That's the only way we know things, right? That's how we know things. We don't know things through revelation. We don't know things through God. We can't trust tradition. Only the scalpel of secular rationality, right? And so in the sexual revolution, they're like, you know what, if we limit ourselves to the scalpel of secular rationality, and we look at the body as a natural object and sexuality as a natural phenomenon, like why shouldn't we be having like orgies in the street? Why shouldn't we be walking around naked? And you can think about like Diogenes of Sinope in that regard, right? He's like trying to walk around naked and masturbate in public because he views all of these things as social constructions, right? They're not real, they're not natural, they're not important. That's how the sexual revolution views them. Like, why are we wearing clothes? This is a weird sort of social convention. It's not natural. We should go with what's natural. And what's natural? Well, Kinsey says like masturbation is natural, homosexual behaviors are natural, et cetera, right? These guys also at the same time, right? They're saying repressing sexuality, not doing what's natural, not allowing yourself to do what's natural, causes psychopathologies, it causes neuroses, it causes your life to break down, right? Sigmund Freud focused on sexuality. He's working on the basis of people like Havelock, who is heavily associated with progressivism. And with progressivism, you get feminism and things like that. Why? Because we're looking at sexual relations, at the relation between men and women as a natural phenomenon, as an object of scientific investigation. Um, People do engage in homosexual behaviors. There is masturbation, et cetera, et cetera. And that's how we should think about them. We should have this sort of objective scientific attitude about them. We shouldn't get too hung up on our moral scruples and traditions and norms and customs. Right? We already have that with Ellis. Right? We could have gone from Ellis to Hugh Hefner basically immediately. The libertines basically are Hugh Hefner, or even worse than Hugh Hefner. And we're talking about the 18th century here. We're talking about no Jewish influence whatsoever, right? Once we get here. Marquis de Sade, yeah, he's one of these libertines. And then we go back and we're like, so what are the origins of this emphasis on individualism and individual rights? And no one should be able to tell me what to do. And I should have full freedom of speech. I should be able to say anything. I should have freedom of conscience. I should be able to believe anything. I'm the owner of my body, right? I'm the carrier of this body. I'm the carrier of my rights. I should be able to dispose of myself as I wish, right? Once you have that, you can go straight to libertinism, right? And that's the attitude that we get from somebody like John Locke. That's the orientation we have here. And with his Enlightenment sort of thinking, with British empiricism, etc., then we're like, okay, well, how does the brain know things? What can the brain know? Well, it has nothing to do with religion, I tell you that. It has nothing to do with the Bible. Like, John Locke is a Christian, I'm not going to say otherwise. But the playing out of these ideas historically, right, are like all you can trust is your experiences and then your sort of rational sorting of your experiences, right? That's all you can do. The Bible, the belief in miracles, our customs, traditional morality, anything that's imposed on us that doesn't come prepackaged with a scientific, rational justification, we dismiss, throw it to the wolves, right? That attitude, again, you wind up with these skeptical thinkers like John Toland, who are like, actually, all we have is reason. You shouldn't accept anything in the Bible. There's nothing that's mysterious. Anything that can be known by rational reason. And you know what? Don't listen to what the church says. Don't listen to what the state says either. It's just us, you know. I'm a free individual. I'll do, say, believe, think, whatever I want. But anyway, I hope you guys have enjoyed that somewhat and you understand a little bit more about this intellectual history. I think the first time I recorded this, it was a lot better, so I apologize for that. But yeah, don't forget to don't simply react, but think culture.